Before there was Wooden Warrior, Quassy used to be home to a different headlining roller coaster. And that coaster was none other than the Monster Coaster, or the Mad Mouse as people more often referred to it as. Removed after the 2010 season, I still have fond memories marathoning the Monster Coaster as a young kid with my father. So in this video, I want to talk about my personal experience on the Monster Coaster while giving a brief history about the ride. And I want to preface this video by saying I have very limited footage of Quassy's Monster Mouse. A big thanks to Solar Yellow for providing a POV, but I have no off-ride footage for Quassy's Monster Mouse, unfortunately. For that reason, I will be using footage from similar rides at other parks to fill in the gaps. This Herschell Wild Mouse originally started as the Monster Mouse roughly an hour down the road at Rye Playland. This coaster operated at Rye Playland from 1967 to 1981. The coaster was then sold to Quassy, but there are some discrepancies when the coaster was actually reassembled. RCDB lists the Monster Coaster's opening year as 1982, as well as a few other sources. However, Quassy themselves have stated multiple times, including in their commemorative magazine, that the Monster Coaster did not open until 1983. The Monster Coaster replaced the park's older BA Schiff Wild Mouse that ran from 1960 to 1983. Now, let's talk about the coaster's identity crisis and why its name is so confusing. Officially, the coaster was known as the Monster Roller Coaster, not the Mad Mouse. That was the official name on the park website and park maps. I have the latter to prove it. However, the park did everything possible to make you think the coaster was actually called the Mad Mouse. Both the sign above the station and the sign on the coaster itself said Mad Mouse. And the really confusing thing about the latter is that when the coaster operated at Rye Playland, it had multiple signs on the ride calling it the Monster Mouse. So after Quassy purchased the coaster, they deliberately went out of their way to purchase new ride signs that said the Mad Mouse. I have no clue why they did this, maybe they got a good deal. But this is why you'll see a lot of people call this coaster the Mad Mouse. But the monster name better represents this particular model. Herschell produced 3 different sizes of their Wild Mouse coasters. They had the small Might Mouse, the standard Mad Mouse, and the larger Monster Mouse. Each version expanded upon each other, and Herschell was actually able to upgrade the rides when requested by the park. The Might Mouse immediately started with the Helix section, and then finished with the Bunny Hills. Herschell built 4 of these models, and none remain. The Mad Mouse added a series of hairpin turns before the Helix and the Might Mouse. Herschell built 2 of these models, and only 2 remain in operation. One at Little America in Wisconsin, and another at Arnold's Park in Iowa. The Monster Mouse added 2 sizable drops before the hairpin turns in the Mad Mouse. Herschell built 14 of these models. None are currently operating, but 2 are currently standing but not operating, one at a park in Ecuador, and another at the amusement park drive-in in Montana. Interestingly, both rides were set up, but neither are believed to have ever operated in their new locations. Quassy's Monster Coaster was scrapped after its removal following the 2010 season, and it made sense for several reasons. 1. Quassy had a very difficult time maintaining the coaster in the end. The ride had operated for nearly 50 years, and Herschell was no longer in business, so it was very challenging to get replacement parts. 2. The coaster's capacity was a major issue in busy days. The Monster Coaster only had 3 vehicles, each seating 2 riders, but in the latter years, I never saw more than 2 vehicles ever in use. 3. The coaster was adjacent to the Splashaway Bay water park that Quassy desperately wanted to expand. 4. Quassy was ushering in Wooden Warrior, an airtime-filled Gravity Group wooden coaster for the 2011 season that would serve as the park's new headlining attraction. And I have to give Quassy credit. They gave fans of the park 2 years' notice that they would be removing the Monster Coaster. And they didn't remove it until they had new additions lined up in both a new coaster for the dry side and a new slide tower for the water park. Today, the Bullet Bowl and Freefall body slides sit where the Monster Mouse once stood. Now, I know there were some rumors the coaster barely passed safety inspections. What I can say is that the park would not have operated the Monster Coaster if it was unsafe to do so. And I think many of those rumors stemmed from the coaster's suspect or sketchy appearance. The coaster looked like it was supported by toothpicks, and the structure would sway violently back and forth whenever a car passed over the track. That gave the illusion the coaster would collapse at any moment. In addition, the vehicles had a very subtle feature. Most coaster cars have wheel assemblies in the front and back of the car. On Monster Mouse, the front wheel assembly was located roughly halfway up the vehicle, directly underneath the seats of riders. This meant that the nose of the car would extend out over the edge of a hairpin turn before you'd actually start turning. This was a terrifying visual, and it really gave the illusion you'd come off the track and fall to your death. These are two reasons why this coaster was easily one of the scariest in the world, despite standing just 33 feet tall or 10 meters tall. For this reason, my dad dreaded riding the monster coaster, but I had to take him with me in order to ride, much to his chagrin. Quassy had a strict two-person policy for the monster coaster. No more, no less. The Monster Mouse originally opened without any restraints, but over time, a shared seatbelt was added. I presume the no single rider policy was added around the time this seatbelt was added, because this seatbelt wouldn't really work for just one person. It's a similar issue to what happens on Jetstar 2 at Lagoon, and why that ride also does not allow single riders. And a funny story related to this. One of the times I was at Quassy, we saw a solo acer arrive looking to ride the monster coaster. But he was completely unaware of the no single rider policy and was dejected he'd be missing out on this rare credit. If you know anything about coaster enthusiasts, you know that some are not afraid to ask to borrow someone else's child to ride a kiddie coaster. Well, my dad did the opposite. He hated the monster coaster so much that he willingly offered me up to ride with this acer without being prompted. It was music to his ears that someone else wanted to take me on this coaster. That's the only reason I have a single photo of myself on the Monster Mouse. My dad took it of me riding with that random acer almost 2 decades ago. Monster Mouse began with the aforementioned 33-foot tall lift, which was just below the park's 35-foot tall height limit. And I loved the clickety-clack sound of the anti-rollbacks in this coaster. It sounded like a token dispenser at an arcade. And because the coaster was built right up alongside Lake Quassapog, the pre-drop gives some excellent views of the beach. But the pre-drop also offered some thrills, as you had a few hairpin turns leading up to the drop. Remember, the vehicle sort of lurches over the edge before it starts to turn. So when you start to turn, you are violently pulled around the turn, resulting in some great laterals, even if you took the turn at a rather slow speed. And then comes the big drop. In the grand scheme of things, it's not very tall at 25 feet or 8 meters. But it was a very good drop. You were pinned to the side of the train at the start of the drop from the prior hairpin turn. And the drop itself was quite tall and steep for a Wild Mouse coaster. And I remember this drop giving a decent pop of airtime as well. You then rose up and rounded a turnaround, which had one of the few non-hairpin turns in the entire ride. You then flew down another drop, and while it wasn't as large as the first one, you had way more speed going into it, so you got an even better pop of airtime. You then rose up into a very bizarre mid-course brake run, and you had to brace yourself for this stop, otherwise it could give you whiplash. The monster coaster literally used a horizontal chain to abruptly bring you to an almost complete stop. This slowed the car down so it could complete the remainder of the Mad Mouse layout at the proper speed. Remember, the Mad Mouse models go into these hairpin turns from a lift hill, so you had to do the same on this ride. If you flew over this brake run without stopping, it would have been the Wild Mouse equivalent of Love Faria's Chimera. But you didn't need much speed for these turns to pack a punch. Again, because of the ways the vehicles were designed, you were whipped around these turns, resulting in some very good laterals. And eventually, these turns led into a drop that reminded me of a small-scale version of the drop off the second lift of the Beast at Kings Island. Let me explain. Both drops are very shallow, and both drops are followed by a very sharp turn to the left where it feels like the train will tear itself off the track. If you're watching the monster coaster off-ride, this is the section of the ride where the structure really swayed, so it really added to the illusion that you'd careen right off the track. You then rose back up and whipped around another hairpin turn, the fastest on the entire ride. You then hit a brake run that slowed you down just a tiny bit, and then you zipped around another hairpin turn and traversed this elongated 360-degree turn that circled around the helix section. This bit wasn't particularly thrilling because of how drawn out it was. That led into the finale. You had a few bunny hills, a drawn-out turn, and a few more bunny hills. Now, I know people praise the one at Little America for giving nice airtime on the final bunny hills, but I never recall getting that type of airtime on the one at Quassy. In fact, I don't recall getting any airtime on the finale. When reviewing the POVs, it appears that the final hills in the version at Quassy were shallower and more smoothed out, whereas the final bunny hills in Little America look noticeably steeper, and you can really tell the car slams down these drops when you watch a POV. But the one on Quassy did slam you to a stop on the final brake run. Much like the mid-course brake run, you really needed to brace yourself for this stop. Thankfully, those aforementioned brake runs were the only two rough spots on the entire ride. The rest of the coaster tracked incredibly well without any vibration despite its age. So what would I rate the Monster Coaster? I would give this coaster a 7 out of 10. It's an above average overall coaster, and I give it an extra point bump for being one of the best Wild Mice coasters. The first two drops gave some good airtime, and the hairpin turns in this coaster were amazing. The sense of danger combined with the laterals made those turns really stand out. The coaster did fizzle out on the final bunny hills and the stops were rough, but I still enjoyed this coaster, particularly the first 2/3. And I'd easily take it over the modern mock or Mauer Sohn mice you find nowadays. The only mouse I definitely prefer is Formula 1, the PAX ejector airtime machine at Park St. Paul, and I probably prefer some of the best Gerstlauer bobsleds if you also consider those wild mice. And I say this is on par with the Vekoma Wild Mouse at Idlewild. While I do miss the Monster Mouse, I understand why Quassy decided to remove this aging coaster. And I cannot complain about the park's additions since the water park is a major hit, and Wooden Warrior is an objectively better overall coaster. So those are my thoughts on the Monster Coaster, Quassy's former Herschell Wild Mouse. What are your thoughts on this coaster? Did you ever ride it or a similar ride? I would love to hear your thoughts down in the comments. If you enjoyed this review, I'd appreciate if you gave this video a like and considered subscribing, because there'll be a lot more roller coaster and amusement park videos here at Canopy Coaster. Thanks for watching.